All right, joining me once again here on the Matthew Filipowicz Show is my good friend Lisa Graves. Lisa is the executive director for the Center for Media and Democracy, which you can find at prwatch.org. You can also follow her on Twitter at the Lisa Graves. Lisa, thank you so much for being on the show again.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks for having me.
All right, so Lisa, a little over a month ago, you were on the show and you talked about CMD's new project, which is Outsourcing America Exposed, which people can find at outsourcingamericaexposed.org. And when you were on a month ago, you actually teased a report that you guys were going to be bringing out on entire U.S. cities being outsourced. And now that report is out, and Lisa, just tell us all about it.
We one of the parts of our profiling, the privatization effort, has been to look at all the ways in which government services have been outsourced, and we were shocked, quite frankly, to find that there were actually whole cities that were outsourced, and they were outsourced in part by a company called CH2M Hill, and so we covered that in Georgia. Some cities, some municipalities actually decided that they were going to not just outsource different parts of the work of government, but in essence contract the governance of the city to a private for-profit corporation. And in some instances, it didn't go well.
Okay, so let's talk about how exactly would this work because it's confusing and also horrific and again, this is like the most extreme privatization you can think of and outsourcing you can think of. How exactly would they outsource the actual government itself, the actual city government? How does that actually work?
Well, so in the case of Sandy Springs, Georgia, what happened was you had a sort of wealthy city within a county that was more rural and poorer in Fulton County, and so Sandy Springs is a suburb of Atlanta. And Sandy Springs decided that they wanted to spin off basically all of the government services that Fulton County was providing and create their own government. But instead of actually creating their own government, the 100,000 person town of Sandy Springs decided to do a contract with a for-profit company to operate basically almost every aspect of town services, including the courthouse, administration of the courthouse, all the trash collection, street cleaning, wastewater, sewage, everything except for fire and police. We're going to be contracted to CH2M Hill, and they would basically be driving around town with logos for the city, but in fact there were it was a for-profit company. And so one of the things that we were surprised about was a couple of years ago when we were began our effort investigating the American Legislative Exchange Council, or ALEC, as part of our ALEC Exposed work, was that there was a big speech that one of the ALEC guys gave saying, their goal was to privatize everything, virtually everything. And that's a summary of what he said. But he was bragging about how there were whole cities that were privatized. And we were sort of shocked by that. We thought that maybe was hyperbole. But it turned out that, in fact, there are whole cities, and 3 cities in Georgia in particular, that had basically fully outsourced themselves, other than fire and police, to the private sector. And so that's what we profiled in our PR Watch story on the company known as CH2M Hill.
And it's like literally this Ayn Rand libertarian Gulch paradise that these people are trying to do, where it's Mitt Romney land, where corporations are people and corporations are the government. Essentially, is what this company has done, right? Yeah,
that's right. In the worldview of ALEC, in the worldview of Ayn Rand, corporations are people and corporations are government in essence. That's what was happening in Georgia. And one of the things that happened along with that, this sort of notion of these contract cities or corporate government, it's sort of a hard thing to get your mind around, is that at one point in one of the other cities that CH2M Hill was operating in Louisiana, people, including newspapers, weren't able to get access to public records because the company basically was saying that they weren't bound by public records because it was a private corporation that was running the city. And so the regular rules for open records, for transparency, didn't apply to them. They just recently settled that case, but that's one of the outcomes of this outsourcing, aside from the lack of accountability, is that you can't, sometimes you can't get access to what they're actually doing, how they're spending their money, who they're giving, who they're paying and how much they're paying for things if they've outsourced it to a private corporation. And so you have a lack of control, but you also have the most fundamental lack of control, because in a democracy, you're supposed to have people represent you that you can hold accountable at the polls and unelect them. But if you create a contract to have some company run your city, you have to have them fulfill that contract, basically everything that whoever agrees to the contract agrees to for 5 years or more, and you can't unelect them. You're stuck with them, and if you cancel the contract unless they've breached it, you have to pay them. So
right, and like a company like this is going to let that go easily and not take the town for every dime it has.
That's right. And so you had a situation with CH2M Hill where even though many of your listeners, and certainly us as well, had no idea this company existed, they're actually one of the biggest government contractors in the country, and one of the least well known. And so CH2M Hill has also been involved in the cleanup after Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, and they actually ended up having to settle some. Let me back up. Their specific role in Katrina was that they were the ones that had the contract to install those FEMA trailers. The trailers that turned out to contain formaldehyde and expose the victims of that hurricane to all these toxic fumes. And so ultimately, last year, CH2M Hill and some other contractors agreed to pay $5 million to settle a suit about those toxic trailers. But there are other instances in which CH2M Hill has been sued and had to settle cases over billing taxpayers, over the quality of what people are getting for their money, which is sort of very different than having government employees accountable, where you can unelect people, and you're not contracting the company whose profit is their highest objective. You have services provided by a state, by the government, whose job is to provide you services, and their job is not to make a profit. Their job is to provide you the best services. Now, that often doesn't always work out, but often we have excellent public services, and the price for the public services is reasonable because there isn't a huge profit motive. Someone isn't being paid millions of dollars in salary out of your taxpayer dollars. But when you outsource these private companies, one of the outcomes is the CEOs get rich on your tax dollars.
Yeah, absolutely. And so does the town have this? So take Sandy Springs in Georgia. The town has no elective representatives. Yeah, I mean, obviously they would have some type of U.S. congressperson, but for like a local government, there really is no local government at all in Sandy Springs.
Well, from what we looked at for that particular city, in essence, the corporation ran the company, or ran the city. Oh my goodness, yeah. Ran the city, and I suppose in some ways a lot of cities have gone to these city managers who aren't the same as mayors. But even with a city manager, at least that city manager in theory can be fired by the city council, or if the city manager were elected, could be fired through an election. But in this case, for the Sandy Springs city, in essence, that was the governance was contracted out, and so you weren't able to unelect them until the end of a contract. Unless the contract ends, they are in power.
This is mind-blowing. Okay, so other than Sandy Springs, what are the other? You have a couple other instances where CH2M is actually doing these the same thing.
So we found that Georgia is apparently the hotbed of this. There were 3 other cities in
Georgia.
In Georgia, yeah, exactly. Johns Creek, Georgia; Milton, Georgia; and Chattahoochee Hills, Georgia. Had basically
not Chattahoochee.
Yes, exactly, not Chattahoochee. Who knew? Yeah. So Georgia is at the sort of forefront of these corporate cities. It's really extraordinary, and we're concerned that is the wave of the future. That's certainly the vision of some of these ideologues who push their propaganda to these state legislators through ALEC. Is this idea that having a rent-a-government is is a better thing. I mean, it follows on this same sort of rhetoric that we've seen in a lot of political settings, which is this notion that Wall Street knows best, or that corporations can do better, provide our services better because somehow the profit motive is supposed to make them more effective. But, that sort of conventional wisdom is belied by reality. What we've seen time and time again is how having that profit motive basically puts us last and puts the CEOs and the shareholders first. And that may be fine if you're making widgets, but I don't think it's fine when you're in the business of providing government. We want our governments to be accountable to us, and we want their highest agenda not to be to make a profit for a CEO or a distant shareholder. We want their highest agenda to be to provide the best services for us. And I think there's an inherent conflict when a corporation is given a role, that kind of role in government.